Today we're talking with Dr. Gay Lindsay, who is lecturer in the Early Years program, and I'm really excited about this conversation because we're going to be talking about children and the arts. So your studies have been in children and the arts, so can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure. So my focus was really on visual arts in early childhood, and the reason I focused on that was because I taught preschool for more than 20 years before I decided to do some research. And as a practitioner, I constantly was amazed at what I was seeing in practice. So people would say the arts were important without a doubt, and I could see that visual arts were part of the everyday curriculum in the early childhood context, but at the same time educators were saying that they weren't artistic, that they didn't know what to do, and that when I would visit centres in the area, because I used to do a lot of visiting of other centres and colleagues, as well as part of some work I did with another organisation, and I just used to see very stencil-oriented work up on the walls, and so I could sense that there was a real disconnect. And after I'd gone to Reggio Emilia in 2008 for a conference there, that's an approach in Italy that has a very strong visual arts basis to their work with young children, I was really convinced that practice was being influenced not so much by what people were learning in their studies, either at TAFE or at university, but by their own lack of confidence to express themselves in the visual arts. And so that lack of what we call self-efficacy in the research world then had a direct impact on what children were experiencing and also what they were missing out on. And so that's what I investigated, was the beliefs and self-efficacy of early childhood teachers and educators.
And so then in the context of thinking about this with families as adults who might be engaging in the arts, let's think about what do you describe as the arts, or for example creativity?
So for me, creativity and the arts are connected for sure, but they're not the same. Mm-hmm. So we can be creative in any domain. We can be creative in science, in mathematics, in our language, in so many ways, engineering. So all those STEM curriculum areas are areas that we're encouraging people to be creative. But a lot of people make the false assumption that creativity is really tied to the arts, and particularly the visual arts. So people align them very powerfully. I like to see that the arts, as a bigger domain, are all of those things like music and movement and drama, and the visual arts, and literature to a degree as well fits within that arts paradigm. And we can be creative in all of those domains of the arts as well. But my feeling is that the arts should be integrated right across the curriculum. So instead of saying we're doing arts as an activity on a Friday afternoon when we've sort of turned our brains off for the week, we should be doing arts as part of science exploration, as part of engineering, as part of maths. And so when we integrate the arts, then my perception is that we're being fully human beings, and especially, in times of pandemic, but also all the time, the arts are what keep our humanity alive. They're what make us sing. They're what human beings do when they're looking for leisure time. So I think it's a real shame when people compartmentalise children's learning rather than treating it as this wonderful exploration of wonder with children.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people will remember that Friday afternoons were either sport, and if it was raining you got to do art. So it was,
I know,
in that primary school years, and also there were moments of stress as well in high school for people because they didn't feel confident, as you said. So what is it about this confidence? Why do people feel so unconfident in their exploration of the arts?
I think there's a lot of misperceptions. Let's talk visual arts because that's sort of what my focus has been. If people a lot of people align the ability to call themselves artistic with the capacity to draw realistically. And so if people don't feel that they can draw, then they will announce they're not artistic. And unfortunately, because of the way our education system works, the arts are gradually diminished as students go through the schooling system. So often by the time our students come to me at university, they have not potentially done any visual arts work for 10 years. And what they remember of their early childhood visual arts experiences are those structured activities that they did at school. Ironically though, people express a real yearning for making art. And if we look at what's happened during this time of pandemic, the arts have blossomed. They haven't been supported, and you know, lots of artists are struggling, but at the same time, everyday people are connecting with the arts in ways they perhaps didn't have the time to do before. So there is a yearning in the human spirit to express ourselves visually. And I'd like to challenge that idea that it's a Friday afternoon brainless activity, because in fact artists are the great thinkers of society. They're the people who grapple with big questions and who reflect society back to the community. They're asking the tricky questions about what's going on and what's my experience and how do I communicate that, or how do I make sense of it. So yeah, there's lots of complexities around the arts.
So how could, if families are thinking about how to incorporate the arts into their everyday, first of all, how can people feel more confident? Like, what can they do to grow in their confidence? They might have had those experiences and feel like, well, I'm not artistic or whatever is the sorts of things that you're saying. How can, first of all, they grow in that confidence?
I think the confidence comes by playing with materials, which we all love to do. So lots of people will doodle on the phone. You know, they're having a phone call, they'll be doodling on a notepad. That's mark making. And so we need to perhaps get away from that notion that drawing realistically is somehow the magic key that unlocks the ability to make art. Because art making, visual arts making, is playing and making marks. And that's all it needs to be, particularly for young children. I like to talk about it as a meeting with materials, that we can just play and explore the properties of those materials and just delight in the process. So it can be cognitive, but it can also be therapeutic. It can just be playful. And so I think that's what I'd encourage families to do, is to get away from the idea that it has to be an end product that they would make. They don't need to go and look on Pinterest to work out how to make a frog. It would be, you know, say for example, if they wanted to draw or make a frog, say to their children, what do you know about frogs? Let's read some books about frogs. Let's watch a documentary on YouTube about frogs. And then talk children through representing their ideas or their theories in a visual way, in a symbolic way. I mean, really, expressing ourselves that way as human beings has happened since the dawn of time. You know, people used to paint on caves to not only reflect what they were seeing around them, but to communicate to other people, but also to delight in beauty. So not all historic, prehistoric art was functional. Sometimes it was actually about just delighting in the sparkle of a rock, or a beautiful bead, or a pattern woven into a basket or a cloth. So there's so many rich opportunities for families to just immerse themselves in the delight of art making.
So there's an appreciation as well of what might be perceived as beauty, or maybe it isn't. So how do you have a conversation with a child about what they're seeing?
I think it's about just deconstructing what they're seeing. So to talk to them about what colours they see, what shapes can they see, what features do they notice. And then I think adults should make art alongside children and with children. So it shouldn't necessarily be I'm standing back and observing you. It's about partnering with children and letting them learn from your mistakes, your observations, so that it's just a playful, enjoyable experience. It doesn't have to have an end. You know, to be successful is to delight in the moment rather than to worry about what's going to be hanging on the fridge at the end of the process.
And it might be an appreciation of other senses as well, other things that are incorporated in there as well.
Yeah,
so getting to the technical stuff, what sort of materials would you recommend would be around the home, simple materials that could create the opportunities for exploration of the arts?
Yeah, well, it's limitless, really.
And there are many shops that can provide us with this experience.
Of course. So, I mean, obviously you can purchase all sorts of art materials online if you don't own any, but what I'd always encourage families to do is to choose materials that make a rich, meaningful mark. So when you're 18 months old, for example, the packet of pencils from the $2 shop doesn't actually make a great mark. So I'd be encouraging families to play with things like charcoal, and if you don't own charcoal, lots of families have wood burners. You can actually just get a bit of burnt wood and make marks with that and experiment with that. I've seen a lot of people during the pandemic times actually playing with using petals from flowers and hammering them and making marks with them between bits of fabric. I've seen people painting with tea and coffee. So you don't have to have art materials to make art. And if you've got cardboard boxes in the house, that is an endless supply of creative opportunity. You can cut out cardboard and cut slits in it and use it for construction. You can make cubby houses and then paint the cubby house. I mean, you just really, there is no limit.
So it's looking around in the environment for what's available rather than purchasing a whole lot.
Absolutely. You don't have to spend a lot of money to do some really exciting artwork with children. And if you've got texters and felt pens, then they're great too, so long as they're making a really rich mark. Often, you know, we need to imagine the frustration that children feel if they're given a yellow pencil and when they scratch it on the paper, it's barely visible. So we need to think about providing that rich mark-making opportunity so that children see that their actions have an impact and that it's a satisfying impact. You know, there's a richness that comes when you can make a thick black mark onto a lovely big piece of paper. I'd also encourage using really big bits of paper if you can get your hands on them, even if that's just newspaper, rather than tinsy-wincy pieces.
Small pieces. So you've given some great tips already, but what would be your tips around having creative experiences at home in the visual arts, for example?
I would just encourage families to have those materials available for children, to partner with their children and sit alongside them and just delight in the play. If you're looking for ideas of what to do, there is plenty online to search for. But it's about just taking the time and playing, I think, is the number one. Not worrying about an end product. Not getting stuck in the idea that children just want to colour in the lines that other people have drawn, but that we really want to encourage them to develop confidence, to make meaning in their way, and to have their voice be heard. That's sort of my number one agenda.
And what about this balance between process and product?
It's a really interesting...
Because we all love looking at beautiful things that have been made.
And there wouldn't be art galleries if human beings didn't delight in the product. In my work, I drew upon a lot of the thinking by a philosopher called John Dewey, and he and another academic called Elliot Eisner talked a lot about process and product. There's a real risk in the common saying we hear that it's the process, not the product. My belief is that it's the process and the product, and that when you use beautiful materials and processes, that actually gives the opportunity for a beautiful product. So it's a partnership between materials and outcomes that can really support children to know that their marks matter. Children care about the product. And so we should be paying attention to ensuring that what they create is valued and beautiful.
And what about, as a final tip for people, how to display artwork as well? Because we know that we sometimes can have multiple products from children, and how to display those in a lovely and respectful way at home or in any environment.
Well, I think the word you said there, respect, is the key. So children won't always care about their end product, but we need to value it, because to me that end product actually tells us a lot about the process that children have undertaken. It's really their voice in visual form sometimes, it's their ideas. And so we need to be very careful not to devalue that product, because it says a lot to children if we just scrunch it up and put it in the bin. How would we feel if something we'd really worked on was just disregarded? So I like to encourage our early childhood teachers that I'm working with to think about how they can trim the edges and display it, either on the fridge if that's where people love to put things, but I used to frame my own children's work and put it in pride of place in the home, just to say your ideas matter, your thinking matters, and I really value what you've worked through there.
That's a lovely way to finish. Thank you, Gay.
All right, thanks, Leanne.